Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Sharifa Al-Uqda of Your Neighborhood Clinic, and today I am joined with Dr. Doniger. Dr. Doniger, please tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Good morning, and thank you for having me, of course. Um, I am I am somebody who comes to the work of grief and loss, working as a therapist with people who are bereaved or experiencing other kinds of loss. Both I come from both a professional perspective and also a personal perspective. Um, for better, for worse, I have pretty much known grief and loss since I was very young. And so when I was in my 30s and decided to become a therapist, I realized I already had all of this personal experience to, really inform the work I was going to do with actual clinical clients and families and communities that I was working with. Since I went to graduate school in Los Angeles. So since I've been back here, since about 2010, I've worked in various capacities, but there's always been a grief and loss component to my work. I mostly work with adults right now, but even when an adult is experiencing grief, they're usually sharing that experience with others in their family who may be children. And so I think some of what I know that I have seen be useful to adults in certain ways, with some, usually with a little bit of tweaking, can be applied to children as well. So
All
that's what I
right.
would say.
Well,
Yeah.
so you've been working in various capacities, but one of the themes that have sort of stayed is this idea of grief and loss. So tell our viewers a little bit about how you define grief and what are some tips on how everyone can manage their feelings of grief.
Well, we say that everyone grieves in their own way. And at the same time, the experience of death, dying, and grief is universal throughout the world. So there are ways in which I think we kind of go through the experience or experiences similarly. One thing that I have found is that a lot of people get support. So if someone has actually died, you get support, you create support within your community when you have, the memorial services, the burials, scattering of ashes, and other traditions that different communities have. But I think why I end up with the clients that I end up with is because after those initial types of mourning and the practices and the rituals kind of cease, a lot of people don't really know where to go or where to look, because the more formal kinds of events are over. And in our society, in American society, we aren't very good at making space for people who are continuing to grieve. And many people, depending on who has died, or maybe who is dying, if it's somebody with, dementia or something that's going to go on for a long time, we don't have so much, our culture doesn't really provide us with a lot of language and also even behavior for people who are going to be grieving for a long time, which is pretty much all of us. When you lose someone important, whether it's your parent or, God forbid, your child or your best friend, whoever it might be, you're not going to grieve for 3 weeks and then you're done. That's just not how it works, because grief kind of stays with us. It's almost like we walk with grief in some cases for the rest of our lives.
Mhm.
So, how do we find ways ourselves as individuals to really attend to that grief? But then, how do we find ways within families and within communities, to allow people or create space for people to do that grief work? In some communities, I was thinking about how when I did live in Los Angeles, um, there were some schools in Los Angeles that had grief groups within the school.
Mhm.
And so sometimes it was professionals coming, from outside the school, maybe for 12 weeks or something, or probably a little bit less than that with children. And then, the benefit of groups, whether it's for children or for adults, cannot be overemphasized, because we know that people tend to do better. Not everybody, but many people tend to do better grieving in community. So it doesn't have to be the community that you live in, but grieving with others is very powerful and very helpful. I today have clients who still work with me one-on-one, but they also continue to go to support groups that they've been participating in for 6, 7, 8 years, because of the power of that feeling of connection with other people who've also lost someone important. So sometimes these types of groups are peer-led. That probably wouldn't happen in a school. You'd need to have an adult in the room, most likely. But I would say that it's one way that people can, rather than feel sort of the stigma that we generally feel when it comes to mental health, with grief, there's still some stigma, like, oh, don't talk about, you're going to upset them if you ask about their deceased person. Most people who've had someone die want to talk about their deceased person, unless they had a really negative, toxic relationship with that person. But even sometimes those people still want to talk about that person because they were important, you know?
Yeah. So I think I've heard you mention a couple of things. One being that you want to engage in some of the standardized or culturally significant and relevant practices of mourning, right? Like having the funeral, having some type of memorial, right? You want to engage with the collective. You want to mourn not in isolation, but in community, whether that is a professional community, as in a support group, or whether it's the family and friend community who also was related to or significant to the deceased person, right? And then I also hearing you saying that you want to be aware that the feelings that the individual may have, those feelings of grief, may be lifelong in some ways. Is that what you were saying? Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And so what I have seen in the work that I do, and I also experienced just in my own life, is that what is important to me and what's useful to me or to some of my clients, when they're farther along. So, for example, with myself, I was extremely close with my father, but he hasn't been alive since 1995. So the ways in which I, honor him, remember him, celebrate him are different now than when I was 25 when he passed. Because early on it's so fresh, you're trying to figure out a lot of things. Whereas now, perfect example, my father's birthday is this Saturday. He would have been 109 years old. So I'm not going to be, for me, I'm not going to be sitting around, like moping and having, a really hard time. If someone were to feel that way, that would be okay. But after 20 something years, it's really a day that I celebrate. So I've invited friends. We're going to get a drink. My dad had a particular drink that he liked, whiskey sours. So, and I'm not really a drinker, but, we'll have that as a celebratory thing and have a nice dinner as well. Not everybody is going to jump to something like that within the first 6 months or a year. And that's okay. But the point is that, ideally, as you move through your life and you continue to attend to your grief, you find different ways to keep the person's memory alive So to remember them and to celebrate them, and to really have ways to continue to incorporate or integrate them and your relationship with them into your current life, into your future life. And for some people, that may feel very strange, like, well, but they're dead. Like, how can they still be a part of my life? And for other people, it's like, oh, yeah, see that bird over there? That's my mom. It really just depends on so many things. Some of it is, I think, tied to a person's spiritual foundation, religious foundation in some cases. It might be that someone's just super philosophical, and so they kind of make sense of things in that way. Even my clients who initially, like soon after their person has died, they'll say to me, yeah, they're gone. That's it. They died, they're gone. A few years later, they'll come back and say, well, when I go down to that neighborhood and I see, certain things, like I have a client whose deceased person was very involved in murals and graffiti and that kind of thing. So now when she goes to certain places and sees, outdoor art, I'm going to call it outdoor art, that she really enjoys, that connects her back to her person. So it's not so much when we say you will grieve the rest of your life after, let's say, your beloved grandmother dies or something. It's not that we're expecting a person to be, like sad and kind of dragging through life for the rest of their life. That's actually the opposite of what we would hope for. We would hope that maintaining what is sometimes called continuing bonds, really maintaining and sustaining continuing bonds as a way to celebrate and keep going, a certain kind of relationship, even though someone is deceased. That can be extremely healthy and helpful.
Yeah. So what do you think are some ways educators can incorporate some of these tips in their classroom?
I think from my somewhat limited experience, I haven't worked regularly with children since I was in California, but from my experience, it always seemed like a good place to start, which I think is the case in a lot of learning, is to just kind of find out, well, what do they think? What is their understanding? What are their beliefs? And also, what are their desires? One child might say, I just wish I could talk to my uncle again. Another child might say, it freaks me out to think about, the death of so-and-so. I don't want to talk about it that much. It makes me uncomfortable. I haven't seen that often, when we give children an opportunity to just share what they think and how they're feeling about people either dying or, being in a state of decline. I think my experience has been that children have plenty to say and they share it. So really first kind of both laying the foundation for conversation and then just being curious and kind of assessing, almost like reading the room. Okay, well, what do they know? And, in some of our communities, of course, the experiences may be extremely different. One child might say, oh, well, they said my grandfather had a stroke and he never came out of it. Another child might say, well, my brother said he saw our uncle get shot. Obviously, those are going to be very different experiences for the children and those families, and how we talk about how you respond, really being supportive of their grief is going to be not completely different, but somewhat different.
Yeah. So do you think teachers should ask the child, or do you think that should sort of be left to the school psychologist? Or do you think, because grief is so essential to human existence, right? Like people, you know, a lot of people experience the loss of a loved one, that there might be benefit in just having like a grief wall where they can commemorate the names of people who they may have lost or that they want to still remember, or, like, where do you think teachers should sort of stand in this line of things?
I think that's a really important question. My first thought is for it to be somewhat of a case by case type of decision, because there are certainly some communities and their schools in our city where death is going to be more prevalent. Yeah. But I think, I certainly, like, if I were to walk into X school, I would first really want to assess. I'm sure that, they'd have to get the okay. I would think they'd have to get the okay from the parents to talk about such a thing. But, we probably can assume that grief is going to be a good, healthy thing for them to have some conversation about. Now, how that happens, I do think, again, would kind of depend on almost like the culture within different schools. Do I think that a grief and loss assembly would be necessary? No. But it could be, a topic that maybe kind of fits into other topics. I can't think exactly off the top of my head what those topics might be. In third grade, you're not studying psychology, but you could.
Well, they might do, I'm thinking like some literature components, or maybe even in elementary school, they talk about like resiliency and even the life cycle. But what I hear you largely saying is that it may be helpful for schools to begin to think about what's going to be their grief and loss policy, right? Like, how are they going to manage students if they hear that there's been a tragic loss, if the school themselves has lost a student, right? Like, I feel like schools may be a little reactive and not,
Right.
they may lose a student during the school year and not sort of proactively decide what's going to be our general grief and loss policy and how we're going to deal with this sort of thread that you said that impacts so many people at varying aspects of their development. And
Yeah.
so I do think that that is helpful for educators, at the very least, just to begin to advocate for a larger school policy around how to integrate this aspect of individuals' life and development. And especially if you are in a school where it may be a little bit more prevalent, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just listening to you, I'm thinking that what I think would be wise would be to maybe have, in a preliminary kind of way, have conversations amongst staff and then have conversations amongst parents.
Mhm.
And maybe together, decide, like, given the circumstances at this particular school, or maybe, several schools in a district or what have you, what do we think, is going to be, like you said, a good, strong, proactive way to create not just a policy, but also maybe specific kinds of responses or even interventions. I don't love the idea of schools. So I'll say something that I'll be pretty minimal with, but I don't love the idea of a school feeling like the only way they can react is when there's a crisis. So let's say something happens at the school or in the neighborhood, and then you bring in sometimes people from outside the community You know what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
And then you even have to sometimes deal with more than one culture trying to address the needs of children who, may benefit from this outside piece, but probably, I believe, would benefit even more so from the actual community that they're a part of. Do you know what I mean?
No, I hear you. So I mean, I think to put it in terms, to proactively be aware of the available community resources that are within the school, that are within the community, that might be even within the parents' repertoire, to know that if and when a crisis happens, we can tap into people who may have a broader cultural understanding and cultural congruence with our specific population. And I think that that's very important. I think that when we are talking about, all things related to wellness, and particularly among in regards to grief, we do want to make sure that we are aware of what our community has to offer, and that we are seeking out professionals who will be culturally congruent and able to work with the population that our school serves.
Yeah.
So keeping that in mind, and that this was supposed to be a mini PD, we just wanted to skim the surface of this. Let us know how our viewers can get in contact with you if they want you to be a part of their network of experts and community resources. How can they reach you?
Sure, of course. Yeah. I mean, I am more than willing to be of service in any way that I can. Even directly with you, because I have a feeling you and I have plenty of collaborating that we could do going forward. We just have both been kind of busy, right?
Yes.
But so for the larger community, my name is Teresa Doniger, Teresa Doniger. That is the best email address for me, Teresa Doniger at gmail.com. That's kind of my broad email account. And then the best telephone number for me is 202-878-1895. That's my work cell. And then also my website is, always out there for the public. It's a sort of new website, so I have to make sure I say it correctly. It's www.cura-counseling-llc.com.
Okay.
And, as with most of us, if you type in my name in Google, you'll find, ways to contact me as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate, you sharing not only a little piece of your story, but also how, we can begin to think about grief and incorporate grief and be proactive around grief interventions for educators as well as for schools. Um, I'm Dr. Sharifa Al-Uqda, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Great to see you too.